Now that we've discussed what you need to give some attention to when it comes to finding the right market, let's start drilling down into finding the right property for you. Now, what should you look for in a property, and what are the important things to consider as you begin your search? I'm going to give you 5 things to consider when looking for a multi-unit property. Some of them will be obvious. I'm sure there's one that you've never even thought about before, and I'll save that one for the end. First, location. We discussed location in the last section when we mentioned a growing population as opposed to a disappearing one. We also discussed finding a rental in an area of interest, like near a university or possibly a vacation destination. Now, as we focus even more on location, we should look at what the surrounding area looks like. Are there lots of multi-units in the area? Does it look like a popular place to rent? Is your target property surrounded by apartment complexes? This could potentially create some competition for tenants. I've always found that the sweet spot is in single-family residential areas with just a handful of 3 or 4 unit properties. Another thing I like to look at is the distance to grocery stores, gas stations, and restaurants. I'm not saying buy a place that's backed up against a strip mall, but having these conveniences within, at least a mile or so can be a real selling point for many renters. Now, next, let's discuss the number of units, or in real estate investor terms, how many doors are on the property. When I have first-time investors come and ask me about my thoughts on this, my recommendation is always the same: 3 to 4 units, always. Why, you ask? It's simple. It comes down to risk. The fewer the units, the higher the risk. The more units reduces the risk. Let me explain. If you're renting out a single family home, your tenant moves out and you can't find a tenant for a month or so. Where has your income gone? It left with the tenant. Who's on the hook for the entire mortgage and expenses? That's right, you are. Now, let's say you have a duplex or 2 units on the property. One moves out. During the time you're looking for another tenant, at least half of your income is still in place, but that's still a big chunk that lands on your shoulders. Now, let's say you have a 4-plex, and I think you know where I'm going here. One tenant moves out. If you're not able to fill that vacancy right away, you still have income coming in from the other 3 units. Even if you somehow have 2 units that need to be filled, it reduces the overall risk. It reduces the amount that you may be paying out of pocket. And remember, the goal here, positive cash flow. Having a property that pays for itself and hopefully pays you along the way as well. So that sounds great. Why stop at 4? Why not 5, 6, or 10 units? The answer again is simple, and you may already be aware of this, but once you have 5 or more units, you're stepping into commercial lending and not residential. The qualifications, the down payment requirements, the process are very different. I don't want to steer you away from properties that fall into the commercial realm. That's the goal for most real estate investors. I have commercial properties over 4 units. They're amazing to own. But for your first venture into owning a rental property, I always recommend the path of least resistance. So you can start earning cash flow, growing equity, and building experience. Then, when the time is right, then you go buy that 20 or 30 unit apartment complex. That time might even be just a few years after buying this next property. The third thing to look for in a property is the overall condition. Now, you may not know the full scope of the condition the property is in from the start. Once your offer is accepted and you have a full inspection done by a professional, then you'll really know. But you need to keep in mind how much you are willing to pay for renovations, if any are necessary. So, all of my personal investment properties are outside of the state that I live in. So my preference is to have them as turnkey and ready as possible. If there are hidden things that pop up in the inspection that need to be addressed, you can be certain. I'm either having those repaired by the seller before closing, or I'm using that as a bargaining chip to reduce the purchase price so that I have them addressed once I take ownership. Some of you out there may be looking for a challenge. maybe you work in construction yourself and you don't mind taking time off from your current jobs that you have to do in order to focus on your investment property. Hey, more power to you. Keep the cost of the repairs though in mind during negotiations. I'm not a contractor, so this has never been, nor will it probably ever be, something I want to venture into. Again, my goal is always positive cash flow, building equity from day one, and that's pretty much what I live by. That's also what I teach. The fourth thing in a property is the current tenant situation. Are there tenants already in place? Is there a unit or two that's currently vacant? Are they all vacant? If there are tenants in place, how long have they been there? Are they long-term or short-term leases? Which usually means a year lease or a month-to-month, with some exceptions. My preference will always be current tenants in all units. Why? Immediate cash flow, immediate equity growth. If one unit needs a tenant, so be it. Once my property manager takes over, they'll be working on getting that filled. Just know that this added expense will be your responsibility. I generally steer clear of properties that don't have any current tenants in place. This generally tells me that the seller most likely purchased this property recently and is now flipping it. Now, I don't want to say that that's always a bad thing. If the flipper cares about the product that they're selling and things have been done correctly into code, you may have a nice renovated property on your hands. Now, this of course is not always the case. And the fact still stands that you are now responsible for finding new tenants for all of your units. And until you do, no income and all the expenses fall onto you. And that's not the position I want you to be in. I want you to see your first loan payment go out and know that every penny of it is already covered by incoming rent. All right. So here's the last thing I want to share with you about what to look for in a multi-unit property. Now, it's not necessarily a deal breaker, but I believe it's something that very few people consider when buying a rental property. Now, whether you've talked to a friend or a family member that has rental properties, or maybe any number of videos that you may have watched on YouTube, I can almost guarantee that no one has ever brought this up. I know because I enjoy watching a lot of the rental property gurus out there. I haven't heard a single one mention this. Again, not a deal killer, but something to consider. For your multi-unit property, are each one of your units individually metered? Meaning, does each one of the units have its own utility meter? Why? Why would that even matter? Well, if you're planning on covering all the costs of the utilities for all of your tenants, then it doesn't matter. But most likely, you want the tenants to be responsible for at least some of the utilities they use. If the utilities are not individually metered, most likely you'll have no choice but to handle all the utilities on your property yourself. For most of the properties I own, I cover water, sewage, and trash. My tenants cover gas and electric, and all my properties are individually metered. I wouldn't have it any other way. So just something to consider as you're looking for your next rental property.